Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the panel today or this session. We have attendees today from both Europe and Asia Pacific, so thank you everyone for joining. My name is Veronica Caraman, and today I'll be your host. This session will be held in English, and the webinar program is, if we can have please the next screen. Yes, you can see the plan for today's webinar. We have quite a number of discussants, and I'm looking forward to them being introduced by Mike. Before I turn over to Mike, who is our moderator, and I will introduce him, please note that the webinar will be held in English, and we will also be recording this session completely. So if you have any issues with any parts of this session being recorded, please do let us know. When you do have any questions, we would like to see them. We're very actually keen to see those questions. So please do send them through the Q&A box. And our promise is to either touch them upon during our discussion or write that down on our website during a week after the webinar. The moderator is Mike Hale, and he is the chairman, Shanghai Mu Yi Investment Advisor and Positive Impact Investor, 3060 Carbon Peak and Carbon Neutrality Researcher, and speaker and thought leader for the Ecological Civilization Special District Initiative. Mike will actually take now over to introduce the topic of the webinar and also the discussants. Thank you very much, Mike.
Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Thank you for participating in this webinar. I'm very happy to be the moderator in the following part of this event. And I hope that you could take away some of the inspiration from the webinar afterwards. All right, let's look into the climate change. Next slide, please. So as you see, there are many challenges under the under the climate change umbrella. The left lists the climate change related problems and the right lists the existing solutions and the goals. We are advocating the climate ambitious to respond to all the problems created by ourselves accumulated in the past 100 years. However, our low carbon transition actually meets significantly resistance from the human nature. In fact, I found that greed and the habit build up the carbon lock-in and the past dependence, which is the root cause of the resistance. We can talk about the pictures, meanings behind it for days. So actually, this diagram depicted not only the problems, but also the human nature intertwined and the implications. So achieving the 1.5 and 2 degrees target of the Paris Agreement will require significant funding, which has been identified as outstanding issues in the low carbon transition. From my understanding of the Global PPP initiative, at least 80% of the funding between now and the next 100 years must come from the private sector. The current level of the private sector investment is not encouraging. I'm pessimistic about meeting the Paris goals on time. Therefore, I focus on the research and development of holistic solutions to accelerate the transition in a better way. I found that the reason for slow carbon transition at present is that, apart from the fact of the technical solutions required a lot of financial support, carbon lock-in and the past dependence must be resolved gracefully, because the decarbonization is about everyone and no one behind. To be successful, everyone on the planet must be actively involved in the process instead of being forced to do. I have found the following interesting issues to share with you. Number one, there's a few domestic academics linking carbon locking and the past dependency with the increasing climate crisis in the realm of ecological systems, environment, society, and the economy. Second one is that there is a few financial experts focus on the financial systemic risks would be brought by the climate crisis. The third one, globally, central banks around the world are still debating whether the climate change factors should be incorporated into the monetary policy and the prudential management framework, although there are many countries, although many countries' governments have a considerably deep depth and breadth awareness of the slow rate of the low carbon transition and the rapid development trend of the climate crisis. Number four, many experts are beginning to worry about the climate mitigation and adaptation might be placed in the second or third priority on the government's agenda due to the post-pandemic recovery demanding and other issues coming up. Therefore, I think it is necessary to refocus on the efficiency and speed of the climate actions at the same time during the social and economic recovery, because the root cause of the pandemic is the climate crisis. After all, it is essential for ecological civilization that we must do a good job to manage the carbon cycle leading to a livable planet. Okay, who is actually having the great influence on combating the climate change? Next slide, please. I found that the central banks must be very important role in the low carbon transition because they are the header of all industry sectors and the financial sectors. This suggests that the policymakers need to escape from the neoliberal economical dogma to achieve a new sustainable economy. But a convincing new economic model has yet to be presented. After deep analysis, if the core issues of the carbon locking, the past dependence, are not addressed adequately, then the final result might cause the climate Minsky moment. I think there are two big reasons behind that. First one is, according to the current trend analysis, even if the nominated climate fund gap is filled, it is very likely that there will be a shortage of high quality of the low carbon assets. The second one is that most existing climate investment finance instruments are date-based. If private and public data becomes too large, then they could easily collapse while facing the arrival of the financial systemic risk caused by the climate systemic risks. Many academics around the world have called the climate-friendly quantitative easing, often referred as the green quantitative easing, after evaluating the QE program of the European Central Bank and the Bank of England. Several academics found that the asset allocation actually benefited carbon-intensive industry and sectors in the economy. This funding raises another key question. Should the central bank remain market neutral in their asset allocation? I believe the central bank should not remain neutral in their asset allocation if climate systemic risk could produce the climate Minsky moment. Many central banks are also testing the central bank digital currency by using the features of the blockchain technology. I think CBDC could be a very good application of the blockchain climate resilient infrastructure on purpose of mitigation and adaptation. I trust that you should learn more about from other speakers. At the end of the 2021, I met Dr. Chen, the founder of the Global Carbon Reward Initiative. He's interdisciplinary researcher and thought leader of the holistic solution to climate crisis. Dr. Chen, the floor is yours. We are looking forward to your presentation. Welcome, Dr. Chen.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you for the very interesting introduction. And Veronica, thanks for being such a great host today. And welcome, everybody in Europe and China, morning or afternoon. Thanks for joining us. I hope you find the presentation interesting. Today's presentation is on a new policy, as you probably have guessed, a scalable finance policy for targeting the Paris goals. The presentation has quite a lot of slides, so I'm going to go fairly quickly, and I'm going to try and get through these 7 topics: the climate crisis, the policy type, policy utility, the justification of the policy, the new scalable finance, the financial mechanism, central bank mandates, and sustainability and fairness. So let's see how we go. Well, first of all, the climate crisis. If you were watching the news recently, you may have heard Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, speak about the latest assessment report from the IPCC, the report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And he said it was a damning indictment of failed global leadership on climate. Now, this is an important concept that the climate crisis could be driven by failed global leadership. I'm going to come back to this topic in the presentation because I put forward a different hypothesis that possibly the main barrier isn't global leadership, but it's possibly the policy toolkit. So the climate crisis in terms of emissions, I'm sure you've seen these graphs. This is a very interesting graph because it shows the allowable carbon budget since the Paris Agreement, and then the adjustment from the Glasgow pledges at COP26, assuming that they are implemented fully. The green wedge indicates that we still have a very long way to go to keep 1.5 alive. It includes a 45% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2030, which is unprecedented, and net zero by 2050. Notably, if we look at the historical emissions, the global financial crisis had some effect, COVID had some effect, but in both cases there was a rebound in emissions. $3 to $6 trillion a year is the estimated finance gap for clean energy and emissions reductions. We might call this conventional mitigation. And there is potentially a $100 trillion gap in finance to remove about 1,000 gigatons of CO2 this century. The reason being that residual emissions from burning fossil fuels and so on is expected to be significant despite implementing strong policies. Where is this money going to come from? The money isn't available, and this is a key part of the climate crisis. In this presentation and with this policy, I'm putting forward an idea that the problem with the climate crisis has to do with policies, and what I'm putting forward here is an alternative conceptual model where we look at policies probabilistically. So this diagram represents three kinds of policies, the dominant kinds. So we have market policies, which include carbon taxes, cap and trade, fee and dividend, offset markets. And then we have private initiatives, such as from commercial banks, green investing, green bonds, EGS, and so on. And then we have finally non-market policies, which are also very important, including laws, standards, emission standards, fiscal spending, the Paris Agreement itself, and so on and so forth. And what I put forward as a concept is that we should look at these policies somewhat like dice, in that each policy will influence the game. So if we want to win this game of achieving the Paris goals, we need to play these dice well. And what I'm arguing is that there are two issues that could be overlooked. One is that we're missing a key dice. So I'm putting forward another dice, another market policy called the Global Carbon Reward. And I'm also claiming that it matters whether or not the dice are funded as sticks or incentivized as sticks or incentivized as carrots. So sticks are bad or negative for people, carrots are good. We like carrots. So the concept here is that carrots and sticks, they interact with each other. Therefore, we need to have the right balance of carrot and stick policies, denoted as yellow and blue dice. So let's come back to that a bit later. Let's start now with the policy type. The new policy is market-based. It's funded with monetary policy, so it's not a fiscal policy, which is unusual. Most market policies are fiscal. It involves voluntary agreements with market actors. The policy is coupled to mitigation performance, so it does not pick winners. And then this is very important because in the narrative of climate change, there is a debate between whether or not we should invest in carbon dioxide removal or conventional mitigation. And here, under this policy, we say we don't pick winners, across sectors. We invest in all of them if they perform. The policy also avoids carbon offsetting, which is quite unique and important. So the policy name, the Global Carbon Reward, is the name of the policy. There's our logo. Notable features. The policy offers performance-based grants called carbon rewards. The policy issues rewards as debt-free carbon currency. The rewards are linked to long-lived service level agreements, or SLAs. The policy creates a predictable long-term price, which is important to be able to coordinate markets, and it does not force direct costs on stakeholders. So we fund the policy without charging society, governments, or businesses. The unit of account is 1 tonne of CO2 mitigated for a 100-year duration or something similar. The carbon currency is issued as an incentive for mitigated carbon in a primary market. The carbon currency is not a medium of exchange, and it does not compete with national currencies. The carbon currency is convertible with national currencies. So this is the instrument for the policy, and we need to understand that the carbon currency is just a tool, but the actual reward is not the currency. The reward financially only makes sense when we compare the value of our currency with another currency, because the carbon currency can't really be used to buy goods and services anywhere. This is actually quite a convenient situation, because if anybody in the world wants to know the reward in their own currency, they simply look up the value or the exchange rate of the carbon currency in the Forex market. For example, for the US dollar, we just go to the carbon currency US dollar exchange rate. And so it's true for all currencies. The carbon currency will be traded in the Forex market as a store of value and an investment. And that's the secondary market where the carbon currency achieves its value. So I'm just going to quickly explain the policy objective, which really characterizes this policy. So the policy aims to manage systemic risk, which is defined by a degree of global warming in terms of the temperature change and probability. So we create an explicit reward price for managing the risk, and the price is developed or designed to target a specific carbon budget for that temperature and probability. This is actually very closely aligned to the Paris Agreement, and it's quite different to carbon taxes. Okay, section 3 of the presentation. Of course, justifying the policy is important, and there are 2 general ways to justify a policy. The first is pragmatic, and the other is theoretical. So many people are actually more concerned about the pragmatic features of finance. How is the finance going to be mobilized? And I'll cover that quickly. Another pragmatic feature is we're going to use carrots and sticks together, which is known to improve cooperation. Political feasibility is tricky. We won't cover that here. Theory, I'm going to introduce the epistemology and the economic principles. There are biophysical principles as well, but we won't have time for that. This is part of the theoretical justification. Well, I claim that the standard economic model for externalities is not general enough to describe the market failure in carbon. As a result, there is a major blind spot in climate policy, and the climate crisis has only deepened over time. So this is a quite an important claim I'm making, because I'm saying we need to shift our attention back to the policy theory. What's the new proposed economic model? Well, the revised economic model for externalities may be called the carbon pricing matrix. This model states that the market failure in carbon is a special case, and that the carbon currency is the ideal tool for managing the systemic risk associated with the anthropogenic carbon balance. So down on the left here, we can see the carbon pricing matrix. We'll come back to that soon. But before we look at the matrix, a good question is, what causes the systemic risk? So what I propose from a conceptual point of view is that there are 3 major sources of systemic risk. It's coming from societal systems, engineered systems, and earth systems. So the man-made systems produce a network effect that locks in carbon dependency, and this creates systemic risk. Here's a list of major societal systems, including the monetary, financial, legal, political, etc. In particular, the monetary system is notable, and I'll come back to that in the presentation. Engineered systems, I think they're obvious. Energy networks, industrial processes, supply chains, and interdependence networks, and so on. The Earth systems, these are well understood by scientists. So Earth systems create tipping elements and complex interactions which are hard to forecast. So this is why we have such risks. Okay, the matrix. What is the carbon pricing matrix? Well, if we go to the standard policies, market policies, I think we're familiar with them. Taxes, cap and trade, credits, carbon subsidies, and a few others that are similar. In this approach, I'm rationalizing these policies into a relational diagram, which is a matrix, literally, 2x2 matrix, and it looks just like this, with carbon credits interfacing with cap and trade and taxes. This is the matrix. We needn't get too caught up in the details. If you're interested, please read the website. But basically, the two columns and two rows relate to the store of value and the unit of account as shown. So with the store of value, there are binary options. It's either going to be a negative price as a stick or a positive price as a carrot. And for the unit of account of the instrument, it can either be a fiat or a carbon-based unit that's holding value. So that's the origin of the matrix, carrots and sticks. The matrix appears simple at first, but behind it is a lot of theory that I imagine mainly economists are familiar with. The general public isn't really familiar with this sort of theory, but it's incredibly important. So we have on the left here, sorry about that, we have on the left Arthur Bagu, who's famous for coming up with the theory for externalities that we use to justify taxes and subsidies. Now, I won't elaborate on that too much because I'm sure you understand what it's about. On the right-hand side, though, is another famous economist, Ronald Coase, who developed this Coase theorem for private bargaining. And his theorem really explains why cap and trade is quite a handy policy because it allows polluters to discover a price that they're happy with called Pareto efficient price. Now, what's interesting about the matrix is that it identifies another quadrant of possibilities which haven't yet been investigated by economists, and it reapplies the Coase theorem, okay, into this quadrant with the reward, where in this new policy we attempt to fix the quantity of mitigation with our service level agreements and a floor price, and then we discover the price of mitigation by trading the carbon credits. So if you're really interested in this theory, check the website or contact me and I can help you there. From here on, I'm just going to talk more about some pragmatic features of the policy, beginning with the new scalable finance. So on the left, we have the primary market where the carbon currency is created. And on the right, we have the foreign currency market where the currency is traded. And this is where demand is managed. Just focusing on the left first, we need an institution, we'll call it the Carbon Exchange Authority, CEA, and it's going to be a new authority under the auspices of the UNFCCC. They will issue the carbon currency to projects that exist in the marketplace for doing the good work of climate mitigation, and that way the carbon currency moves in this direction. When they have the carbon currency and they want to spend it, they will have to trade it for local currency, and they'll do that by trading with people in the forex. And they will trade with private currency traders. Could be you, me, mum and dad investors as well. When there's insufficient demand from the private sector, the central banks will come in and buy more carbon currency, or their share of it, with a process called carbon quantitative easing. And what that means is this carbon currency eventually is going to make its way down into central bank reserve accounts, where it will stay for a very long time. Some people have asked me, Delton, what happens to the carbon currency after 100 or 1,000 years? Do we destroy it? My opinion at the moment is that we don't need to destroy it because it can sit in reserve accounts forever. It doesn't technically need to be destroyed, but that's something for academics to think about. So this is the basic system diagram. There's an ecosystem on the left for creating the money, ecosystem on the right for managing demand. And I'll expand on this some more as we move through the presentation. So here we have the 4 steps for creating the currency in the primary market. This is the market on the left side. Now, it's very simple, really, if you think of it in these steps. A business that mitigates and wants the reward would first apply to the Carbon Exchange Authority. They would then be given a service level agreement, which they need to sign, assuming that they're qualified. They mitigate. They experience periodic assessments by licensed assessors. The assessors are paid fees and commissions. Then the business earns the carbon currency, which will be stored in their private bank account. The primary market, 3 reward rules. This diagram, I'm sure you've seen before. It's quite a well-known kind of diagram. It's showing the future carbon budget to the year 2100 for a scenario something like 2 degrees. And what you'll notice is that we need to reduce our emissions quite quickly to achieve net zero sometime before the end of the century, technically around 2075 for 2 degrees. That means that all this carbon in here has to be avoided via conventional mitigation, and the reward policy incentivizes this with 2 rules. One, a rule for cleaner energy, and a second for cleaner business. So I'll just elaborate on that quickly. The energy rule uses a parameter called carbon intensity of energy to set a goalpost. We don't do the assessments based on actual mass because it leads to illogical results. There are all sorts of problems with additionality and scenarios. We take quite a different approach, which I'll explain in the next few slides. Similar with businesses, we're going to use carbon intensity of cash flow to set the goalposts. And similarly, this resolves the problem of additionality. It's quite a different approach here. 2 key points: no carbon offsetting is rewarded, it's discouraged, and no double counting carbon. The reward for carbon removal, it's fairly straightforward. It's just a reward for mass of carbon on a life cycle basis. So when we come to calculating the reward, the formula is quite straightforward. We have our exchange rate. So as I said earlier, you choose the currency you're interested in. In this case, the example is US dollars. So that gives us the actual value of the reward in US dollars per ton of CO2. And we can multiply that exchange rate by the mass or the base mass that's calculated, assessed for the project, whether they're using the cleaner business rule, the cleaner energy rule, or the carbon removal rule. And that's it. It's called the base reward. Let's think about this a bit more deeply in terms of the energy sector. The energy sector has some real challenges, real major problems, because they have so much fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas that they would like to dig up and sell. And whilst they are making some effort to decarbonise, I think it's well known that the energy sector is not decarbonising nearly fast enough to meet Paris goals. So how do we move this along? Well, we're going to offer a reward, but we're going to do it in a way where we require the energy company to submit an aggressive transition plan for retiring their fossil reserves and dirty capital. So they'd come to us with a convincing plan that really pushes the boundaries, and if they are convincing, then they can come in the policy and earn the reward. The actual rewards won't simply be multiplied by the exchange rate, which I've shown you. It's also a function of the carbon intensity baseline that I mentioned earlier. For each energy commodity in each distinct energy market, there will be a unique carbon intensity baseline. That's carbon intensity of energy. And this metric will be prescribed so that we can calibrate the reward for them to make sure there's enough finance there for their long-term planning to decarbonize. And this reward will absorb the risks for them and provide them with debt-free revenue so they can justify taking quite a big risk with an aggressive energy transition. And this is how we could potentially incentivize the early retirement of fossil fuel resources. So that's a bit of background to the energy reward rule without going into the specifics. The pleaded business, it's somewhat similar, but as I said, the metric is carbon intensity of a different output. It's cash flow here. Businesses will have to submit a plan for decarbonising, consumption, reducing emissions, and so on. Small and medium-sized businesses and households, they'll have to amalgamate into collectives to raise their significance before they could join the reward policy. Reducing emissions at source is the main objective. Removing carbon from the air is also included in assessments. Carbon offsetting is excluded from assessment. Scalable finance for carbon removal. Well, this is incredibly important because, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, we may need about $100 trillion, roughly, for carbon removal this century, depending on how the technology advances. So this rule, in effect, would create a whole new economic sector for that work, which is absolutely enormous, removing carbon from the ambient atmosphere. In this section, I'm going to cover the financial mechanism. And I've already shown you this diagram. So I explained the diagram in terms of the way that the carbon currency flows from the Carbon Exchange Authority through the primary market. It's sent on sold to currency traders for reasons that they need the money. And then it goes into reserve accounts of central banks. The mechanism, actually, to explain the mechanism, we just really need to explain how this works, because this is where demand is created. So we need to understand how the central banks, with their carbon quantitative easing, can actually influence the price of the carbon currency and encourage the private sector to buy the currency. So let's have a look at this. To understand, we have to come back to the carbon pricing matrix for a moment. And a quick look at it. I just want to remind you that down the bottom left is a graph of the social cost of carbon. Economists will understand that that's a price to maximize market efficiency. Oops. But here on the top right, we have a new concept. We're going to introduce a reward price for a positive externality. And importantly, the reward is used to manage risk. And a key difference is that with the reward, the temperature change that results from the policy is an input. It's an input to the model to give the price. This is the opposite to taxes. Taxes and Bugge's theory, the temperature change is an output of the model to achieve efficiency. I just thought I would emphasize that to make it clear. So here's our reward price. And what I'm going to try and do is explain how this works in terms of market sentiment and how people would respond. So what you're looking at is a reward price for 100 years. Now, the blue dotted line is the forward guidance, which is a best guess for what it should be, and there's an error band. The green line, which is quite short, is the guaranteed floor price. And the idea here is that our central banks over here, they're going to literally guarantee this green line as the lowest possible value of our exchange rate. Here's our exchange rate in US dollars. So when people trade the currency, they know they're going to never lose out below this green line. Imagine we've moved from the year 2025 to the year 2050. So we're in the year 2050 now. And I want to point out that everybody in the world will know that the price is roughly going to rise and peak. It'll peak around 20, or maybe 2080 or so in this example. So there are two phases. There's a positive yield phase and a negative yield phase. In the positive yield phase, our private sector will buy the currency. Why? Because it has a positive yield, a minimum positive yield. So here is the illustrated spot price that we can't predict. It's product of market speculation and trading. There'll be volatility, but that's what it will look like conceptually. So we're in the year 2050 now, and so let's see what happens in the next 25 years. Oops. Okay, so we've moved now to the year 2075. We're approaching the peak. And the point here is that throughout the century, simply by having the central banks guarantee the floor price, it will incentivize currency traders to buy the currency. So what we're doing, in effect, is we're transferring the mitigation costs into the private sector through this notion of Cauchy bargaining. And the beauty of it is that it doesn't impose any direct costs on stakeholders. When we move past the year 2075 in this example, we're then into the negative yield phase in the longer term. The point here is that because the yield is now negative, the central banks will be doing most of the buying. That's what will happen later in the century after the climate crisis is resolved. So hopefully that makes some sense. This is kind of the mechanism behind everything in terms of market psychology and the role of central banks, carbon quantitative easing. In this section, I'm just going to reflect upon central banks and their current mandates and their current philosophy. So here we have a picture of Christine Lagarde, the president of the European Central Bank. And this is a quote from her that might be about a year old. But a reporter said that she said, central banks are not responsible for climate policy, and the most important tools that are needed lie outside of our mandate. Now, I know that there are people in the central bank community who would like to see more progress on central bank policy and mandates. But quite clearly in that community, there is no overwhelming or powerful reason for the central bankers to argue for expanded mandates. And it's my opinion that this situation actually is a product of the theory that I have shown you previously with the carbon pricing matrix that says that we're missing a policy and a conceptual model that points to a more meaningful role for central banks. So thinking back to the COP26, which I'm sure many of us probably did watch a bit of anyway, you may have seen Mia Mottley give her talk at the opening ceremony. And what I found interesting about Mia Mottley's narrative is that she pointed out that the central banks, the wealthiest countries, had engaged in 25 trillion of quantitative easing in the last 13 years. So quite obviously, central banks have an enormous capacity to influence the economy. So the question comes up often nowadays, what can central banks do to address the climate crisis? Well, here I put forward my argument, my reasoning based on the policy I've shown you, based on the carbon pricing matrix and this theory of Cauchy bargaining, Cauchy trading with the carbon currency. And I'm just going to highlight what I think are common statements in the standard response from central bankers, and then I'll put forward the climate responsible response as I recommend it, or as I see it. So to expand central bank mandates, there is a point made that green quantitative easing has limited utility from shifting the carbon budget towards the Paris goal. There are studies that say this, and I tend to agree with them. They make sense. I don't see green quantitative easing as being terribly effective for achieving the Paris goals. And it's to do with the way these green bonds are really just loans, and the private sector is quite happy to buy green bonds. We don't really need central banks to buy the bonds necessarily. Here, what I propose is that we need carbon quantitative easing under a new global mandate. So carbon quantitative easing, as I've tried to explain, is really quite different to green quantitative easing. Carbon quantitative easing doesn't involve loans or bonds. Second point, governments are responsible for climate change. This is a commonly said point, standard response. And I put forward the notion that governments actually have limited capacity to influence climate change because they're quite divided, both internally, domestically, and internationally. As you all know, different countries, different cultures, different governments have different situations and perspectives on the climate problem. Importantly also, central bankers say, well, you should use a fiscal policy. Well, what I argue is that fiscal policies, whilst they're important, it's one of those dice I was talking about, I'm arguing that fiscal policies are actually very vulnerable because all it takes is a change in the economy, a recession, or lack of revenue, or inflation, so on, and the fiscal policy is under threat. Central bankers and economists often point to the need for market neutrality as being essential to their mandate or protocols. What I argue is that the fiat monetary system is actually growth dependent. Central banks target a certain amount of inflation, a certain amount of growth, so on, because it stabilizes the financial system. Fiat money needs growth. Growth drives energy consumption, and energy is coupled to carbon. So the monetary system itself is not neutral to the climate. Therefore, I argue the market neutrality argument should be reviewed. Central bankers are concerned about the technical assessments. How do they assess all this complex climate change impact and mitigation effect? It's very difficult. In this policy and the mandate I put forward, they don't need to do any technical assessments because we introduce the Carbon Exchange Authority, which does it all for them, for the world. We don't need the central banks doing that kind of scientific work because it's not what they're really trained to do. So finally, central banks are doing probably a very good job of managing financial risk or addressing it. And what I'm saying is that it's not enough. The societal, the biophysical risks are poorly managed, and those three systems, the societal systems, engineered systems, and the earth systems, are really driving the systemic risk. And we don't have a policy that's specifically designed to address those systemic risks. And what I'm arguing is that that's the missing link, which we need to bring in to climate responsible mandates for central banks. So that's my key argument. Let's have a look at sustainability and fairness. This is the last section of the presentation, and I thought I would end with sustainability and fairness because this is very important for people both morally and ethically to understand if a policy is good for people and the environment. So the way I've titled it is to talk about new social and macroprudential principles. On the right-hand side, what you can see is the same symbols you've seen before. This represents the secondary market where carbon currency is traded. There's our private currency traders and investors, our central banks doing carbon quantitative easing. That's all the central banks in the world, most of them, working together on the one policy. So what we have potentially is a new set of social principles whereby we could say that protecting our climate, biosphere, and society should be viewed as a global public good. That has implications because if you have a global public good that you create, that by definition qualifies as a positive externality. The approach should be managed as an insurance problem with no direct costs. What kind of insurance? It's preventative insurance. No direct costs. Why? Because all the costs are channeled into currency trading and central bank currency trading. The new approach as a principle complements the polluter pays principle. So we have another social principle. Actually, it's called the preventative insurance principle. And this is important because I'm saying polluter pays isn't sufficient in the situation we're in, because if the ship sinks, metaphorically speaking, it doesn't really matter if the polluter pays or not. If the ship sinks, we all go down together. By virtue of the fact that the policy can divest the costs into currency trading and there are no direct costs for stakeholders, this may very well help overcome the divide between rich and poor countries, the global north, global south. It also creates lots of opportunities for the global south, the developing countries, to undertake carbon removal projects and to decarbonise their economy. And finally, the policy, as far as I understand, it is consistent with CBDR and RC, which stands for Common but Differentiated Responsibilities and Respective Capabilities under the UNFCCC. So if you know what that means, you're following closely all this policy narrative. But basically, it's saying all the countries in the world have a different economic and social context, a different history, so we can't expect all countries to respond in the same way. Every country has to respond in its own situation. So that's the macro social principles. With this policy, we have a great opportunity to invite stakeholders, that's people such as yourself, to participate in the policy. So the policy can give you representation for deciding on what co-benefits should be rewarded. Now, I'll just clarify this point. As I said earlier, in the primary market, the Carbon Exchange Authority will reward projects that do mitigation. However, this policy has another function where we can adjust those rewards in terms of the mass to further incentivize co-benefits, which include energy reliability, community well-being, and ecosystem health. When this process is managed, the general idea is that we would invite industry associations and experts to help evaluate the co-benefits for energy reliability. We would invite community members to help evaluate the co-benefits for community well-being, that's their well-being. And we'd invite land stewards and experts to do something similar for ecosystem health. So this is a decentralized approach. It's kind of very open source, and it's very open to innovation and different ways of achieving consensus on co-benefits. And I think this is quite an interesting feature of the policy, that we could create this regenerative style economy through the primary market for the carbon currency. Now, I'll just make one final point about sustainability of the policy, and that is, for the policy to be sustainable, it has to be funded. All the assessments, all the administration will cost a lot. It's going to be expensive. How do we pay for it? Well, the interesting thing is the policy will pay for itself, because a fraction of the carbon will be redirected back to the Carbon Exchange Authority as fees and commissions to pay for the assessment. The price of the reward will be adjusted to take that into account, and so we have a self-sustaining and self-funding policy for global carbon removal. Thank you. That's the presentation.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chen. That was a great presentation, and you actually explained more than I expected. So now we're entering the panel discussion. Now we have actually we invited three discussant panelists today, but however, Dr. Han he has some urgent things to do, so then he couldn't make it. He already shared his sorry to everybody, but never mind. We looking forward to the next time to collaborate with him. So now we have a panelist, Dr. Rens van Tilburg and Dr. Yifeng Tian. Dr. Tian, we know that quite a bit of time, and Dr. Rens, could you make a short introduction about yourself?
Yes, thank you very much. So I am the director of the Sustainable Finance Lab, which is a think tank in the Netherlands at Utrecht University. And we have as our members, they are mostly professors from different universities in the Netherlands. And we got together 10 years ago, so after the big crisis of 2008. Actually to put on the table new thinking about sustainability and the financial sector. And so we've been working on a lot of different topics. We started actually to work on climate risk from 2014 onwards, very much focusing on supervision. And the last couple of years, we've been working a lot on monetary policy, specifically on the European Central Bank. Actually there, I think Dr. Chen already said some things about how well Christine Lagarde is thinking and her peers at the ECB. I think it is a bit of a question of the glass half full or half empty.
I'm sorry, Dr. Rens. That's exactly I want to ask you because after the presentation, and I'm sure that you already studied a bit before the presentation. So, in overall impression that what this theory is benefited for your research in the sustainability in the existing project in overall, especially on your project.
Yes. Thank you. So maybe let me start by thanking Dr. Chen for his well, I think we can say groundbreaking work in this field, because I think it is a very important conversation that we are having, and that is also the analysis that we have made at Sustainable Finance Lab. Where we until now have mostly been working on the Dutch and the European financial system, including the role of central banks. And we ourselves are just more or less starting to work on well, the what we say the international global monetary architecture, and how that is related to well, the global common goods like climate change that we have been talking about, but also biodiversity, which of course in many ways is very much related to climate change. And so we find very interesting to see all the work that Dr. Chen has done. I do have some comments and questions also on it, but I think it addresses one of the most crucial questions, which is how to allow emerging economies to actually invest in climate mitigation. Because what we see is that in Europe, for instance, and it is actually quite a recent thing, is that across the whole political spectrum, political parties are really understanding that they need to act upon climate change. So in Europe, we have the Green Deal, we have the Fit for 55 program, as it's called, which is an enormous and unprecedented package of all kinds of policy instruments, meant to make sure that in 2030 in Europe the emissions will be 55% below the 1990 levels. So in that sense, I am getting more and more hopeful about the willingness and also being able to tackle climate change in Europe, and I think in the US Hopefully, we'll see a similar development. But the real worry, I think, in order to attain this global public good of a stable climate, is that we should also allow the poorer countries of the world to make the needed investments, because it's essentially in Africa, in Southeast Asia, that the biggest population growth is happening at this moment, where people are going towards the city. So it's there that the big infrastructures are being built. And is in essence where they also therefore have to make the choice: do we do that in a old-fashioned fossil way, or are we going to invest in more sustainable infrastructure? And already, luckily, by now, often if you look at the whole life cycle of those infrastructure, the clean alternative is not more expensive. Often it's actually cheaper. However, the initial investment needed is still often higher for the cleaner alternative. So if you are a country which is currently short on liquidity, then still you may feel pressured to invest in the fossil infrastructure. And I think that's what we see happening. So I think the real crucial question of our time globally, so to say, is how are we going to make sure that also the poorer countries are able to invest in these clean infrastructures. And I think what we learned at the COP26 is that the current discussion around this climate fund of 100 billion, it's totally insufficient. So remember the numbers that Dr. Chen showed in the beginning of his presentation. We ought to be talking about trillions, not billions, but even these 100 billion, we've been talking about it for 10, 15 years, and the money is still not on the table. And I think that has a lot to do because it's very hard for politicians in the richer countries to tax their own people in order to make this funding possible. And I see an analogy there with what happened in Europe during the Euro crisis of 2010 to 2014, where we had also a very similar problem. So we had a problem in Southern Europe. All the economists could tell you they are not going to be able to solve this themselves. So we need to have transfers from the north to the south of Europe. But there was no politician in the north who was able to actually put that such policies on the table. And a very famous quote is from the chair of the European Commission at the time, Juncker, who said, "We all know as politicians what we need to do. We just don't know how we can get elected after we have done that." And so I think that in essence shows the shortcomings of the political sphere here. And in Europe, it was in the end solved by the European Central Bank. It was Mario Draghi, the president, who said that the ECB was going to do whatever it takes to save the euro. And they started unprecedented policies, which are about quantitative easing. And I think that analogy of thinking how we can use those central bank powers in order to now also avert climate crisis, I think that's a very fruitful way of thinking. And I think in that sense, Dr. Chen, he was one of the first to start to explore this. So very interesting and good work.
Thank you, Dr. Rens. That was very insightful about the climate policies in Europe. Thank you.
And I just have to say I'm not a doctor. I'm only a doctorandus. So I'm the director of the secretariat, and so I'm actually so my background is more in policy and not as much academic. So we're building a bridge between academia and practice. That's what, and I'm the practical side of that.
Okay, sorry, director. Okay, and now I come to Dr. Yifeng Tian, and Dr. Tian, after the presentation, what kind of the takeaway you have from this presentation? Could you share with us in general?
Thank you for the introduction, Mike. First of all, that was an excellent presentation. Dr. Chen proposed a very interesting and promising solution to bridge the climate finance gap. My background is in the blockchain-enabled green finance. My research team at the University of Florida has been working with the team at the University of Michigan on creating the tokenization-based infrastructure for the climate finance since 2018. Our research articles were published in the journals and conferences, and also one of them were published at the working paper of the Asia Delton Bank. There's no need to say how important it is to provide enough capital in the climate sector. We have been talking about the gap for years, but is money the problem? Don't we have enough money available? In the ultra-low interest rate environment, capitals in the world market seeking investable opportunities are abundant. The main impediment to the greater climate investment cannot be the lack of available financing. But if the money is not a problem, then what a problem does? It is rather of that matching the supply of finance and resources from the private sector with the climate goal of the public sector and the entire society. The ESG integration and the need for the climate finance solutions has never been this important in the history of humankind. However, our financial system has remained relatively unchanged in the past decades. There's urgent need for sure for the new financial solutions or even revolutionary financial vehicles to address the need for the climate finance, the specific climate finance goals to achieve the goal of the Paris Agreement and the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We all understand that the climate goal cannot be achieved by neither the public or the private sector independently. In fact, the private sector's involvement can improve both execution and financing of projects. It is crucial for the public sector to provide the right condition to reap those benefits. If a financial solution is designed properly, private entities demand for the economic returns to compensate for the risks that they are taking can be incentives to address the climate issues and facilitate the renewable transition. The global carbon reward model proposed by Dr. Chen shows the potential to mobilize the private finance to bridge the gap with the support of central banks, which are in the public sector. It would provide a platform to enable the mutual efforts to both sectors, which is super important to address any climate-related issues. We believe if it is implemented properly, it could be a feasible and optimal way to realize the climate goal in the near future.
Thank you, Dr. Tian. That was a great comments. And now, actually, since Dr. Han is not available due to some urgency, so then I have a question to Dr. Chen about your presentation, because in my previous speaking, I'm talking about the climate mitigation is about everyone. Everyone need to participate, no one behind. So following your presentation, I saw the last slide, you said the fairness and the sustainability. That is great. So could you share with us that as from the citizen perspective, from individual perspective, how they can really work with this policy and how can they benefit from these policies if this policy has been implemented properly?
Thank you for the question, Mike. It's a very good and interesting question. I ask myself the same question quite often, and that is, how would society respond if this policy were actually implemented? And I tend to think about the way Australians respond to the real estate market. So I live in Australia. It's a wealthy country. You probably know that real estate prices in Australia are astronomical. It's similar in many developed countries. And because the value of property rises, it creates its own social momentum and morality. So if you go to a barbecue or a dinner in Australia, people often talk about property prices. And what I think happens is that if an activity is profitable, it tends to be accepted morally. So when we move over to environmental work, particularly with carbon offset credits and carbon markets, there's an overlap between the profit motive and the environmental sustainability motive. And I noticed that new types of people are coming into this space to try and capitalize on this because it feels good. It has a certain social acceptability, it's exciting, it's new, and it synergies two motivations, the profit motive and the moral environmental motive. Sometimes people are not consciously aware of that and they start to behave in strange ways, such as speculating in markets and so on. But if we extrapolate this out to the whole world, I do believe that a rising price for mitigated carbon, because it's a profit motive and because the currency itself is an investment vehicle with a reasonably good return, speculative, but better than, say, cryptocurrencies, the more people invest in it, particularly average people like mum and dad investors or ourselves and our friends, as people enjoy the benefit of the profit from the currency or from earning income from climate mitigation, this will filter through society and it will change the moral landscape. It will become much more morally unacceptable to not mitigate. Why? Because more people are doing it, the neighbors are doing it, your friends are doing it, the business down the street's doing it, and then suddenly you've got a tipping point. And if we can get this in place, I think there will be a political evolution where the moral transition will be followed by stronger taxes and regulations, as the laggards are then treated as the people who are just immoral, in a sense. You know, the fossil fuel companies that didn't try to decarbonize and so on. So this is my theory of change. It's quite a experiment. It's difficult to run an experiment so large to know for sure. However, there are at least 3 studies where social scientists have explored the dynamics of carrots and sticks in gameplay. And these studies found conclusively that carrots and sticks combined maximize cooperation. And so there is something about it that I think we haven't tapped into yet in economics. That's synergy of carrots and sticks. And then beyond the human psychology, the simple mathematics tells us that if we have red and black on a balance sheet for a business, things start to get ugly. If there's too much red, you need some black to be able to afford to pay bills and pay wages. Thus, carrots and sticks is good for business. And then for governments, if I just make one last point, and I'll hand it back to you, Mike, maybe I'm diverging a bit, but one last point. If governments can adopt a new mandate for central banks, it'll take a lot of the cost off their fiscal budget, off their balance sheet, and it will free them up to focus on what they're probably better at, which would be adaptation and just regular public services and so on. So that's my answer, Mike. Hopefully that was good enough.
Now I have a question for Director Rens, Tilburg. So could I ask you that, I saw that you have some project ongoing, which is you're exploring the possibility, how the climate change influenced the policy and some of the policy which is really address the climate crisis. So in those projects, as you can see, now we have the carbon market, we have the carbon market pricing model. As you can see, that all comes from the polluter pays based model, and the actually instruments is only addressing the externality and the negative externality of the carbon emission. So what's your perspective? What's your thought about the existing carbon pricing model? And despite Dr. Chen's presentation, in your research, what's your feelings about, and how this existing model related with the current speed and low carbon transition? So do you have any thoughts about
Yes. Thank you very much for your question. So I find it very interesting, this idea of Dr. Chen, that that there is a synergy of having carrots and sticks approaches. I must say that increasingly I see that that there are other carrots on the table as well. So in terms of subsidies, where they also sometimes try to mix that with market mechanism. For instance, in the Netherlands, we are building large wind parks at the sea. And essentially, the procedures to do that is that they ask market participants to offer how many windmills they want to place there, and they have to say how much subsidies they need to put it there. And so there is a competition, and the one company that can do it with the lowest subsidy, he then gets the possibility to actually build those windmills. So there are increasingly these kind of approaches. Nevertheless, I do not see them yet on the global level, and I think that's where this proposal of Dr. Chen is coming in, and which is very, very interesting. I also see that there are other options on the table. So very interestingly, last year, as a response to the pandemic, the IMF decided to create new special drawing rights, which you can see also as a way of sort of like a global currency, to the tune of $650 billion, which is almost a doubling of the existing number of special drawing rights. And at this moment, the IMF is trying to see if they can get those funds into what they call a sustainability and resilience trust that could then be distributed to poorer countries to do, for instance, climate adaptation, climate mitigation. So then I think you get to something very close to what Dr. Chen is actually proposing, but you take another route. And what I find interesting, so that would be my question to Dr. Chen, is how he sees the relationship between what he proposes and such developments at, for instance, the IMF, but also the carbon offset markets that are expected to grow very quickly in the coming years after their sort of like breakthrough at COP26. But also, for instance, in Europe, we have a emission trading scheme, which for a long time didn't really work because there were too many permits. But in the recent year, prices have gone up to 80, sometimes almost 100 euros, which comes rather close to the price that economists have calculated as what they should be in order to really incentivize companies to become Paris aligned. And in the model of Dr. Chen, there's a very important role for central banks to sort of like keep a floor price at the right level. And how does that floor price relate to, for instance, the price that we see in the carbon offset market, in the ETS in Europe, and in other schemes around the world? Because in the end, I think what you would expect is that those prices would grow towards one another. So how does his price relate to that? And my main question actually on the working of the carbon reward is that I understand that you want the price to rise, and central banks can play a role in that in the early phase, in order to stimulate private parties to hold the carbon currency. But once the price is going to go down, as Dr. Chen said, then you would expect the central banks to come in and buy a lot of those carbon currencies. But I think essentially what we see in that graph is the absolute price development. Well, I think what is most important for asset managers is the relative price development. And of course, we don't know how asset prices will develop. But we know that the economy is going through a huge transition, and that could also severely put down the estimated return on assets. So maybe we could actually have the same effect without rising prices. And how then is this fixed price taking into account these market developments? Those are my questions that I'm struggling with in order to get my head around the carbon reward proposal. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you, Director Rens. So that's a very insightful, and thanks for your sharing with the IMF tools, new tools similar to the GCR, and also your questions that keep bothering you in the research project. That was great. So Dr. Chen, go ahead.
Yes, so I'll attempt to answer Ren's questions, very good questions, and also one of our audience has submitted a written question, which I'll try to get to as well. We might go over time. This webinar won't shut down exactly on the hour if you want to hang around. So with the IMF versus central banks, my thinking lately is that rather than getting into a debate between whether it should be a central bank policy or an IMF special drawing right arrangement, maybe we should try both ways, or design the policy so that the supporting institution could be central banks or could be the IMF, and just figure out how they both interlock as options. My intuition is that we might get progress more quickly or easily with small countries to do a pilot with their central bank. If we follow the IMF route, I'm not familiar with the politics in the IMF, so I can't comment, but I'm just going to make the assumption that it's a big institution, probably a lot of politics in the background. So I think rather than putting all our eggs in one basket, why not offer the policy for both ways and just see which comes out the winner. I don't have the details on the IMF to talk about the technicalities, though. Carbon markets, ETS, yes. Carbon price in Europe went up close to $100 a tonne for various reasons. And how would the global carbon reward interact with existing markets? From a technical point of view, I think it would work as long as the carbon accounting is kept separate, so there's not double counting. The global carbon reward stocktake is a bit easier to manage theoretically because there are no border adjustments. It's one global policy. You don't have to worry about allocating it to which country, that type of thing. But where the global carbon reward's really going to make its impression, I think, is in reducing our reliance on carbon offsetting and carbon credit. So if you think about it, the carbon market's very much focused on carbon offset credits as a source of revenue. And then those credits, if they're purchased by polluters in compliance markets, they'll want to use them to offset emissions. Or some companies want to go green and look green or be green. Now, my claim is that the reward will lift the needle. It'll make carbon mitigation more profitable, and market actors will choose the reward or carbon offset credits based on price. A lot of it will be based on price. If they can't qualify for a reward at the higher price, I think it will be a higher price eventually. They will settle for taking carbon offsets because they didn't qualify for a reward. Because the reward will have some stringency about it. We've got these 100-year or very long-term service level agreements, and they have to pass through some hoops. So we wouldn't just give rewards to any technology. It has to be a technology that's somehow scalable or is relatively well proven. So I see the long-term price of the carbon reward, the carbon currency, its backing by central banks, its longevity, its predictability, it will eventually outpace the carbon market we know of in terms of absolute value and market preference. So I see the future being that a lot more most carbon will go for a reward, and where it's too difficult to get the reward, companies will just offset as they do today. And so I see them all playing a role. I think you might acknowledge, or many people would acknowledge, that there's a lot of criticism of carbon offsetting because it doesn't actually reduce emissions at the source, and there's risks involved. So that's the whole point. If we, instead of offsetting, we don't offset so much, we reduce the risk, and that's the whole point of the risk management approach of carbon rewards. Ethan might have a question, and I don't want to ignore you, Ethan, because you've been sitting there quietly. I'll hand it back to Mike, but I'll just point out to Mike that someone asked, we have a couple of questions in the Q&A as well, which we can get to when you're ready, Mike.
That's great. I just have one question for Ethan. And thank you, Director Rens. That was a very good inside question, because for the IMF too, I think it's very interesting. But to my knowledge is that if we compare these two, the GCR solution and the IMF new withdrawal right, so if that right is based on the date, then that should be the difference from the GCR policy instruments. So that's I want to share my comments. So okay, Ethan, and you are actually working with the infrastructure development project before you had the doctoral degree study in the US. So could you share with us that following this Dr. Chen's presentation, or what sort of the key comments you want to share with the audience? So please go ahead.
Thank you, Mike, for the question. And actually, my field is in the blockchain, and I saw a question about the blockchain, and Dr. Chen in his lecture would also mention about blockchain. So I want to give my comments and answer this question based on the perspective of blockchain. Our research should complement Dr. Delton Chen's global carbon rewards model to engage the private sector's contribution to addressing the climate financial issues. In our research, we consider the green infrastructure facilities, like those renewable energy plants, no matter that's solar or wind farms, as a new asset class. By tokenizing those assets into small value tokens, the small values can be just $1 or 1/10 of a dollar. The retail investors, which is also mentioned by Dr. Chen and Mike, the individual engagement. So through those tokenization, the retail investors and small and medium-sized enterprises worldwide, including the surrounding community residents, they can invest and actively participate in the development of green infrastructure projects. The retail investors and SME, they were excluded from the financing and the development of those projects, those climate or the green projects, if their capitals and resources can be tapped through a new financial instrument. The trillions of dollars would be unlocked to close the gap and actually expedite the transition into a greener and more sustainable future. The tokens backed by the green infrastructure assets are a type of NFTs, the non-fundable tokens, but they're not cryptocurrencies because they're backed by the assets with the values in the real world. The tokens, they can be security tokens or the utility tokens. Security includes the project loans, debt, equity, or funds for the green projects. The utilities, they can be the access to the energy, for example, like energy trading platform, the access to trade those energies, or like the tolls in the toll roads, or even they can represent the electricities available in the secondary market. Also, monetizing the positive social and environmental benefits and converting them into tokens to engage the private entities, also a topic that we have been working on. The blockchain tokenization could enable the creation of world of decentralization. By applying that, narrowing or even closing the climate finance gap could be done in a decentralized way. Based on our research team's perspective, the integration of the global carbon rewards model with blockchain tokenization is super exciting. We believe the blockchain could play a very important role in that. By leveraging blockchain, the information generated in the transaction of the rewards, they can be recorded on blockchain immutably, which is available to the internet users worldwide. If the global carbon rewards, they can be represented by the crypto tokens. They do not need to be the cryptocurrency. They just need to be a certain type of tokens. The liquidity can be improved by through the trading activities in the secondary markets, includes those existing token exchanges. There are many other potential benefits that we can talk about, like how we can integrate token, blockchain with the global carbon rewards and other financial solutions. It will be very interesting for you to be explored in the future. Yep.
Great. Thanks for your comments, Ethan. That was great. And the time is flying. So we actually have some questions in the Q&A area, and Dr. Chen, and I just picked one question for you. There is a gentleman called Josh Dogdale, and he asked, should be currency based on the blockchain? So would you like to answer this question? I think this is the only questions left for the audience. Sorry for the time limited. Yes,
thanks. Thanks for the question, Mike. Thanks for the question, Josh, and the audience. A lot of thought has gone into whether or not the carbon currency should be a blockchain currency or not. And despite all the thinking, it's still unclear, because if a carbon currency is introduced, it may very well need to be compatible with existing infrastructure for foreign currency trading and commercial banking. And they use gross settlement systems, which is old school. There are ways to bridge blockchains to these existing systems. And so we would need expert advice on the best technology for the carbon currency. However, sometime this century, maybe not that far away, central banks will be using central bank digital currencies, which are probably blockchained. If they come into existence in wide usage, they would be ideal for interfacing with a blockchain carbon currency. So we would have the carbon currency on a similar platform as CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, and essentially they are all blockchains as far as I understand, or would be. So the answer isn't as clear as yes or no. I'm not against blockchains. I think the blockchains have a great future in the measurement, reporting, verification, and the stakeholder representation, which is incredibly data intensive. I'd just like to make another comment on what Dr. Tian was saying about financing in a decentralized market. And I also acknowledge that we've gone over time by 5 minutes or so. So if anybody needs to leave, don't be shy in letting us know. But I'll just comment on the financing. I think it's very interesting if we had a carbon currency traded as described in the presentation, then everybody, literally, individually, we could all buy carbon currency and express our desire to help the climate crisis. Now, personally, I've never bought a bond. Okay, I wouldn't know how to buy a bond. So if green bonds, climate bonds are traded amongst institutions, it's not something that your average person can really get involved in, not today anyway. So I do sense that there's a lot more capacity to mobilize private money into climate mitigation through micro-investing, interfaced with the global carbon reward, and creating secondary markets for small investors to invest in mitigation projects that are going to be funded. And this could work well in developing countries where people are using smartphones and personal devices, and they're familiar with digital currencies. So I think there's a bright future if we could get that system right. So I'll hand it back. Thanks, Mike.
Okay, great. Thanks for your answer. I still can see Josh have some comments in the Q&A area. So everybody, thanks for your participating with this webinar. So, and if you have any questions, send into the Q&A. We will answer it later. And this video has been recorded, and later we will publish the Chinese and English subtitles videos on the internet. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Director Rens. Thank you, Dr. Tian. And thank you, David, our our technical support for this webinar. And thank you, Veronica, and for your great remarks. And okay, everybody, have a nice weekend. Okay, see you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, you
Bye-bye.